Could go on YouTube. Hey, Raj.
Hey Eric, how you doing?
Good, good.
Hey Kevin,
Hey,
how you doing?
I'm good. Oh, how was your break?
Good. Dealing with a cold right now, which is unfortunate,
Oh,
but
that sucks.
Yeah, so we had a little over 500, maybe like 520, 530 people sign up for this one. So
nice.
pretty good interest in the topic.
Awesome. This one's always a popular one.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad we'll have a better quality recording for it now.
Yeah.
Good old air meat.
Right?
Oh, is that what the first one was on?
Yeah. It wasn't even
Okay.
Air Meat Pro, it was like the starter pack.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'll record locally so that way we have a pretty high quality version. I imagine people rewatch these and like they're trying to zoom into like the code screen and like they want to see what it says.
How's your break, Kevin?
It's good. Yeah, it was really laid back. So it was nice.
I'm going to try extra hard to mute when I'm not talking because I don't think coughing's going to add to the, yeah, coughing is not going to be helpful.
It was not a best practice.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think I was telling right after I got back from Atlanta, I was working with Bryson and we were giving some presentation. Maybe it was like an intro to airflow thing to somebody.
Mhm.
And I was saying, like, I'm not used to anymore, like, being out in bars and stuff so much. And like, I had totally lost my voice. And it was just all like hoarse and weird. And I was like trying to give this presentation, like every 3 minutes, I felt like I was going to start coughing and like
Yeah.
needed water. And I was like, Bryson, like, are you okay? Like,
Yeah.
vocal cords don't have any endurance anymore.
Yeah, it's that, and I just don't have any like social energy anymore either. Like I'm
Well,
around
that too.
a day, right? I'm like, all right, next rest of the week I'm hibernating.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. You can start whenever. I think it's we still have a minute.
Yeah, everything's good to go. So I'll do you guys see the blue button to start webinar? Do you guys have access to that? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, let you guys hit that when you're ready. Thanks, guys.
Cool. Go ahead.
All right, let's go.
Get it all out. All right.
All righty. Here we go. All the folks jumping in. So I guess I realized on the last one that the default chat goes to all panelists instead of panelists and attendees. So if everyone who's jumping in right now, if they want to change their chat to panelists and attendees so that everyone else can see your messages, I guess Zoom doesn't let you set the default to that yet. So hopefully we'll fix that soon. But in the short term, everyone just needs to send their thing to all panelists and attendees. Speaking of which, we'll do the usual, like, where are you dialing in from? But for the folks in the US, we can also say, like, best thing they ate on Thanksgiving. That seems relevant, unless you have any better ideas, Kenton.
No, I think that's great. I can start. So every year, probably like 10 years ago for Thanksgiving, I made this pumpkin gingerbread trifle, and everybody loved it so much that I now have to make it every year. And I ate so much of it this year. I'm like still carbo loading, even though I'm not running. Like, you still do that in the off season, right? I think so.
Yeah, I'd say so.
It was pretty good.
Yeah. One of my cousins, so we don't really do like traditional Thanksgiving food because my family is vegetarian. But one of my cousins made this pretty incredible like mashed potatoes with breadcrumbs. And then, you know, like a simple thing done really well. And then my aunt makes these like veggie cream cheese rolls. And I don't know why they're so good, but they're very delicious. So definitely those two things.
Interesting. Sounds really good.
Yeah. All right. We'll wait about 3 more minutes here. Lots of familiar names in here. Lots of astronomer people too. It's always good to see.
Crowd favorite.
Right? Hey, Rick. Hey, Rodrigo. Hey, Sanjay.
I love seeing people from so many different countries.
Yeah. Apparently, this is still the best time to do it, though, like the 2 p.m. Eastern time. I don't remember who I was speaking to about that, but of all the time zones, right? I think this one is supposed to be the best spot.
Interesting. I feel like I got the best end of the deal, but maybe everybody else likes it too. So.
It's 11 a.m. for you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. 2 p.m.
But much more of a morning person. If you asked me to give a webinar at like 9 p.m., it would not go particularly well. I'd have to try a lot harder, think about it a lot more.
Yeah. I think this time of day is best for me, and it's 2 p.m. So it's just about the same. We have some folks like it's 16 to 6 o'clock. That's later in the day. I don't know what time it is in Moscow, but can't imagine it's ultra convenient.
Probably late. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see here. So we got
12:30 a.m.
Oh no, maybe this isn't the best.
I'm super impressed that anybody could even be awake at that time, much less learning things. That's really cool.
All right. Hey Ray, how you doing? Get started about 5 after. Do intro and quick note on logistics, then we can get going.
It's good.
Alrighty, so let's jump in and get started then. 5 minutes past. I know there's still a few folks dialing in, but I think we can go ahead and get started. First off, for those of you in the US, hope you all had a good Thanksgiving, got some good rest and eats up. Thanks for joining us this Tuesday, November 30th, for a rerun of, I think, what was our first webinar, right? Intro to best practices. And then we're going to do that kind of a refresh one just because so much has changed. Couple of notes on logistics. The slides and the content was sent out in an email afterwards, so no worries about that. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A in the chat. We would love for these to be as interactive as possible. Also, please be sure to set your chat preferences to all panelists and attendees, because I don't think that's default, and that's something that we learned last time, that other folks were seeing other folks' chat messages. So quick note on that. One other thing is, this is our second to last webinar of the year. We have this one, and then we have one 2 weeks from now, but then we're going to take a break for the holidays and get started again the second week of January. So that's all from my end. Without further ado, Kenton, I'll kick it over to you to intro yourself and kick us off.
Awesome. Thanks, Faraj. Yeah, hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. I'm Kenton Danis. I'm a field engineer at Astronomer. I'm really excited today to talk about DAG writing best practices. As Faraj said, this was our very first webinar that we did, seemingly forever ago now. But it's definitely a crowd favorite topic-wise. We find it super helpful to people. So yeah, really excited to talk about that. I'm going to go through the content, as Faraj said. Definitely throw questions in the chat or the Q&A. I will leave some time at the end for just general Q&A for anything that we don't get to kind of as we're going through. So with that, I will go ahead and share my screen and get started. Cool. So again, today I'm going to talk about DAG writing best practices. I'm going to focus on kind of the DAG authoring side of things and cover tips and tricks for you to get the most out of your Airflow experience. Before I dive in, I want to start off really briefly with just some kind of high level background in case anybody here isn't as familiar with Airflow or you're newer to using things. So in general, super high level, Airflow is a tool for programmatically authoring, scheduling, monitoring your data pipelines. It was originally developed inside of Airbnb, since been open sourced. It's now a top level Apache Software Foundation project. Obviously at Astronomer, we are heavily invested in Airflow and really believe it's the de facto standard for data orchestration. Airflow has tons of great qualities, and a lot of the best practices I'm going to talk about shortly will help you actually realize the benefits of some of these. Obviously in Airflow, your pipelines are written as code, which means you're going to have the flexibility of Python behind you. And it was designed with scalability and extensibility in mind. So again, we want you to be able to actually kind of get at these benefits because they're really going to help with your general data pipeline experience. And then one quick note here, again, just for anybody who is newer to Airflow, since this webinar is on DAG writing best practices, we'll define what a DAG actually is. So it stands for Directed Acyclic Graph, and it's your data pipeline. The main rules for DAG are that your tasks flow in one direction and have no loops. So something like this example on the right is invalid because of that loop between T1 and T4. Airflow won't actually let you define a DAG like this, so I wouldn't necessarily consider it a best practice, but it kind of is a best practice to not have infinite loops in your code. So that's a good place to get started. But with that background, I'm going to go ahead and hop right into the best practices piece. So I'm going to cover them here in the slides and kind of toggle back and forth to some example DAGs that will highlight some of them so that you can see them in a more kind of hands-on way. Okay, so our first best practice here isn't actually specific to Airflow, but rather applies to all data pipelines, and that's item potency. So in general, item potency is the property where an operation can be applied multiple times without changing the result. So if you think of like a crosswalk, no matter how many times you push the walk button, the same result is going to happen, as much as that might frustrate impatient people like myself. But when you apply this concept to your data pipelines, that means designing your DAGs in such a way that if you rerun a specific run of that DAG, you'll get the same result as you did the first time or any subsequent time. So we'll talk about more about this when we cover some examples, but in general, applying this concept is going to help you recover faster if something breaks and make sure you don't incur any data loss, especially in cases where you do have to rerun things. So the next high-level best practice is to use Airflow as an orchestrator. So remember that Airflow was designed to be an orchestrator, not an execution framework. More practically, you can implement this best practice by doing things like using Airflow providers to orchestrate jobs with other tools, offloading processing to execution frameworks that were designed for that, like Spark, using an ELT framework wherever possible. So again, that means kind of offloading that transformation piece to the end tool where your data is living. There's lots of great tools that are designed for that these days, things like Snowflake, dbt, stuff like that. So definitely make use of those. And then if you do need to process things in Airflow, use intermediary data storage. Again, we'll talk a little bit more kind of about what that looks like. But in general, it also means that you do not want to pull large data sets into your task and process them using something like pandas. Now, again, this is super common to do things this way. I have done it myself. I implemented workflows like this pre-Astronomer. It's super tempting. It's really easy to implement. And we do realize sometimes it's unavoidable. So again, these are best practices. There are always exceptions. This included, and for smaller data sets, doing something like this is generally fine. But again, you're not going to get the most out of Airflow's built-in scalability this way. And if you are designing something that you want to be really robust and to scale up with your data, that's not the way to do it. So. And this slide is just to highlight that, again, Airflow is designed to be an agnostic orchestrator, meaning you can implement something super complex like this in terms of a pipeline with a ton of different systems with relatively little code. That's one of the biggest benefits of Airflow. Through the network of provider packages, it's going to play really, really well with lots of other tools. So use that benefit. And you're going to have kind of the best time when you can pick tools that are specifically tailored to the task at hand and then bring them all together with Airflow. So with that, I'm going to toggle over and show an example of this in practice. So again, I'm going to start off with kind of a use case here and show two different DAGs, one that does not implement the best practice of using Airflow as an orchestrator and one that does. So we'll start with the one that doesn't, just give kind of a sense of why you might not want to do this and kind of where the pitfalls are. So for this example use case, we're going to assume I have a pretty basic kind of ETL, ELT type workflow. I have some data in a Postgres database. I want to refresh a materialized view that does some transformations on that data, and then perform some additional transformations before sticking it in another table. We're going to assume that this data is relatively large. So not just, 100-row table or something like that. So in my first DAG here to implement this, I have defined this Python function. I am using a Postgres hook to make a connection to my Postgres database. I'm then executing this SQL statement that refreshes my materialized view. I'm then using pandas. I'm grabbing this data, pulling it all into memory, and then using some built-in pandas functions to pivot the data. We'll assume that's my transformation in this case. And then I'm using this toSQL function to stick it back into my end resulting tables. So that's it. I have just this one task, then I use a Python operator to call it. If I flip back and come over to my Airflow here, this is my orchestration bad practices. You can see my graph, just a single Python function. So again, this is pretty easy to implement. One of the tempting things about doing things this way is, again, because you have Python kind of right at your fingertips, especially if you're someone who has worked with pandas or like other ways of processing data like that in Python. It's super easy to implement. Like, it doesn't require a lot of research or other tools or anything like that. But there's a couple of downsides to this. One is that, again, you realize I'm pulling all of that data into memory in this code, right? Into pandas here. If my data frame is really going to be really big, this is going to potentially bump into issues with kind of scalability in terms of what my Airflow infrastructure can accommodate. It's also going to be really slow and not super performant. So if you're familiar with pandas, that's kind of one of the downsides of it is it doesn't operate really fast, especially these toSQL and read SQL functions. You're going to have not a great time with these if your data is very large. So again, that's kind of one downside there. The other downside is that because of the way I've implemented this, everything is happening in this single task. You can see that in this case, my task has failed. If I want to kind of figure out where this failure happened, obviously I have logs available to me, but it's going to be more difficult because I've got like 6 operations happening in this task. So not very easy to debug. And if I do figure out what's wrong and I need to rerun it, I have to rerun the entire thing, right? There's no way for me to rerun just part of a task. So because I have everything kind of lumped together, that's not very good from a keeping tasks atomic standpoint, which is a best practice I haven't talked about yet. So again, especially if you have a case where your data is kind of large and this is really slow, now I'm in a position where I have to wait all that time all over again, even if my failure happened at the very end. So again, not really a best practice in terms of design. Obviously, this can work. It is a real example. You could do this, but not going to be the best for you kind of in the long term. So let's hop back and kind of look at a better way of implementing this. So I'm going to hop over to this orchestration good example. And right away at the top, you can see that I'm importing a couple of other operators here. The point here, remember that the best practice was to make use of provider packages. So those are going to be packages external to the core of Airflow that are going to provide hooks and operators and sensors for Airflow to interact with external systems. Airflow community is super robust. There are tons of these out there, including really popular ones like Databricks. So any sort of commonly used data tools, there's probably going to be a provider already out there for you. And the goal of using them is, again, to be able to use a tool that's really designed to do what you want to do for your particular task, and then have Airflow be able to orchestrate it in a really easy way without a lot of code. So that's what I'm doing here, making use of those providers, and I'm going to use them to offload that processing to another tool that's designed for that. So I mentioned Spark earlier. Databricks is obviously built off of Spark. You don't have to use Databricks. It's just an example. There are lots of others you could use. But in this example, in my DAG, I go through here and in this case, have a Postgres operator. So again, using a more specific operator for my use case to do that initial refresh of the materialized view. I'm then going to go ahead and use these Databricks operators to submit jobs to Databricks that are going to do that transformation for me. So if I look at this DAG in the UI, you can see that one benefit here already is that I have things broken up into different tasks. Each task does a specific thing. So if one of them fails, I can address only that failure without having to worry about anything that happened upstream. And then again, making use of kind of tools that are built for that processing framework, offloading all of that and coming back here. And then I can go ahead and, get what's best out of Airflow for the orchestration. I can have all of my logs. I can see what's going on. I can build off of this if I need to. So if Databricks isn't going to handle, the eventual loading of that data, I can add other tasks to do things like that. Cool. So with that, I'll hop back over to my slides here and talk about the next best practice. So We covered using Airflow as an orchestrator. The next section of best practices is going to focus on kind of DAG design. So again, these are things that are not necessarily going to keep you from using Airflow, more just help you make the most out of it and make sure everything in your Airflow environment is going to be sustainable and scalable. And the first concept in this section, which is going to support that best practice of idempotency that we talked about, is templating. So Airflow supports Jinja templating and using templated fields, variables, and macros. This is going to help keep your DAGs idempotent, make them easier to maintain, and again, easier to recover from any failures. A great benefit of Airflow is that many commonly used variables are already built in. As this kind of example, this is taken straight out of the Airflow documentation. These are all well documented. These are some of the variables that are available to you. So you can just reference them in your code. Not really any extra lift on your part. And Airflow is going to take care of all of that for you. Those are then going to get, pulled in actually at runtime of your DAG and, applied correctly. Also related to DAG design are kind of best practices around keeping clean DAG files. So this is going to help with readability, ease of use within your team or across teams within your organization, and in some cases can actually impact scalability. So some good points to remember are use a consistent project structure. Astronomer has one that we like to use internally that ships with our CLI, which is open source. So you're always welcome to download that and take a look at that project structure. Or you can create your own, but again, just using the same one is going to help everybody within your team and across teams within your organization kind of know what's going on within an Airflow project. The next is define just one DAG per Python file. Again, there are obviously exceptions to this. If you have like dynamic DAGs or things like that, it might vary. But if you have static DAGs that you're just defining in code, just put one per Python file. Seems a little obvious, at least to me, but this can make things super messy if you define lots of things in one file. And then avoid any top level code in your DAG files. So by top level code, we mean anything that isn't part of your operator instantiations or kind of DAG configuration that is actually going to get executed. So I'll show an example of this in a minute. But in general, it's helpful to remember that all code in your DAG file is going to get parsed by Airflow every time this min file process interval variable is hit. So this variable is configurable, but it defaults to 30 seconds. So that's pretty often. So again, if you have code that like takes a really long time to run that's in your DAG file, you can cause performance issues if you don't kind of tweak your Airflow settings. So again, best practice is to treat your DAG files as much as possible as almost like configuration files. Lift out any other code elsewhere, either within your Airflow project or again, if you're offloading to other systems entirely. And this will also, again, help make your DAGs a lot easier to read and maintain. So with that, I'm going to hop back to another example here. And again, we're going to start with the bad one, kind of figure out what's wrong with it, and then move on to something better. So in this particular use case, our DAG is going to execute a couple of different queries for a set of states that get data for today's date. So these are pulling like COVID cases from a database, and I'm going to define and say I want to do it for some certain number of states. Once all of the queries are completed successfully, we're going to send an email. So the way I've implemented this in this DAG is to upfront kind of define what my dates are. So you can see I'm defining today and yesterday. I'm just using a Python datetime function to do this. And then go ahead and define my DAG. And then I have created a different Postgres operator that's going to run a query for each state. Again, so I have multiple of them. I think I'm doing West Coast states in this example. So I've dumped the SQL right into the DAG file. And you can see within it, I'm pulling in that today and yesterday parameter that I defined up top. I then go down, I have another Postgres operator, another query, keep going, I have another one, and then finally the email operator. And then down here, I've defined my dependencies. So you can see this is a little bit complex. A couple of lines of code for that definition, but if I hop back to Airflow, let's go to our, oops, that's the wrong one. That's the good one. Look at the graph view. You can see this DAG is actually pretty straightforward. So a couple of things that are wrong with this. The first is that, again, remember, we don't really want any top level code. So code that's calling functions kind of outside of your operator that's going to get run every time the DAG is parsed, not great. In this particular case, obviously calling like date time isn't going to cause any performance issues in Airflow, but it does sort of violate that best practice. The other huge issue with doing the dates this way is that it's not item potent. So if I were to run this DAG run for, today, I would get today's date and yesterday's date. If I come into the office tomorrow and realize that it failed and I need to rerun it and I retrigger it, it's going to run for today, which is now tomorrow. So you can see that's not going to be the same result every time that we run this. So that's not ideal. Doesn't really give me any sort of way to accurately recover from any failures. The other thing that is, not great with this DAG is the way that I've thrown in the SQL. Again, this is perfectly viable in terms of how I've defined these operators, but it's really not very sustainable. It's not readable at all. I've got all of this code. It's kind of hard to see what's part of the SQL query and what's not, and where I'm passing the parameters in. I've got it 3 different times. So if I needed to make a change to the SQL query that I wanted to apply to every operator, I'd have to do it in 3 different places, which leaves a lot of room for error. If I wanted to add another query, so let's say I, want to expand beyond the West Coast and query for New York, where Virage is, I'd have to kind of come in here and copy this and paste it. So again, not super easy. And then finally, the task dependency is kind of a silly example, but this is just not very clean code. Again, it's perfectly valid in terms of an Airflow definition, but I couldn't easily look at this and figure out kind of what the dependencies are within the stack. I have to go look at the graph view. So it's just not done in a very readable way. So again, one of the goals with DAG design is not necessarily just performance, but also making sure that, everybody on your team can easily look at your DAG and figure out what's going on. And that's going to make it, easy for people to update and for you to kind of work cross-functionally there. So let's look at a better design for this DAG. So I'm going to hop over to this good example. And right away, you can see I no longer am defining those dates up top. I am defining a list of states here. Go ahead and instantiate my DAG. That's the same. Now instead, I have this loop here that is looping through this list of states and calling the Postgres operator for each one. So if I needed to add another state, in fact, I have done that here. At Colorado, I can easily do that. They're all calling in the same SQL queries. You can see my SQL is no longer just defined out within the operator. I'm calling it in from a separate file, which again is both, it can help with performance if you got to a big enough scale within your Airflow environment. The one I'm showing here probably isn't enough to make a difference, but it's also a lot more readable. So to do that, you can see I'm calling this SQL file. I've also defined this template search path here, which is going to tell Airflow, hey, I want to look for code that I'm going to pull in from a separate file. And then you can see in this include directory over here, which is part of our Astronomer kind of standard project structure, I have this COVID state query.sql. If I open this file, you can see here's my file. For the query I want to execute, I now just have one place to update. So if I wanted to run this for all 50 states or other countries or whatever, still only update in one place. The other difference here is you can see within this query now for the dates, I am calling built-in Airflow variables. So this yesterday DS no dash and this DS no dash are the current date and yesterday's date. But again, built into Airflow. So those are now relevant to the execution date of my DAG run. So if I were to rerun something, I would get an actual idempotent result. So no matter how many times that I run it for a particular DAG run, I'm going to get the same date pulled in. If I go look at this DAG, in good practices here, you can see the DAG itself looks the same. So again, same result, but remember the code from that other one was really long and it's now only 50 lines. I've also redefined those task dependencies in a more reasonable manner. So again, same result with DAG design, but this is a lot more readable. It's way easier to understand what's going on. It's going to be a lot easier to update and a lot easier to recover kind of from any failures. Cool. So with that example, back over to my slides. And next thing I want to talk about is kind of some best practices around Airflow 2 features. So obviously Airflow 2.0 came out last December. We've since released Airflow 2.1 and 2.2 came out a couple of weeks ago. All of those releases have new features that are designed to help improve the DAG authoring experience. So want to cover some of these and kind of how you can make the most out of them. Again, these are going to make your DAGs more readable, scalable, sustainable, all of that. So one is task groups. I didn't talk about it in depth, but I'll go back to it in a minute. But my last example actually did use a task group. So these are a way to kind of visually organize your DAGs. They're going to keep things a lot cleaner in the Airflow UI. In my DAG where I just have like 4 tasks, again, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference, but you can imagine as things get a lot more complex, and I'll show a more complex example in just a minute, they can help a lot. They can also be a replacement for sub DAGs. So that's can be my actual best practice recommendation to you here is to use task groups instead of sub DAGs. If you're familiar, sub DAGs can have a lot of performance issues. They're not really first-class citizens in Airflow. Task groups are going to be kind of a much better option, at least if you're using them in terms of kind of organization. XCOM backend. So this was a 2.0 feature that allows you to define a custom XCOM backend. So if you are going to use Airflow to actually process data and you need to pass that data between tasks, remember I mentioned one of the best practices was intermediary data storage, which means, you know, use something else other than the Airflow metadata database so that you don't overwhelm it. Using a custom XCOM backend can be a really good way to implement that if that is the best way to go about your use case. Next one is the task flow API. So again, I'll show an example of this in a minute, but this is going to allow you to, you know, really cleanly define Python operators and instantiate your DAG and kind of pass data between tasks if you need to. So that's a great way of keeping your DAG files clean. Lots of Python developers really like using task flow just as a kind of preference for DAG authoring. Couple of Airflow 2.2 features that I want to call out that kind of go into best practices. One is deferrable operators. So these are specially designed operators that do not take up a worker slot during their execution time. So say if you are kind of offloading framework or offloading tasks to another processing framework, that's really great. Again, that's best practice, but sometimes it requires, if that processing takes a long time, you have an Airflow worker just kind of sitting there that task is taking up. Deferrable operators are designed to release that task slot during that time, and then pick it up later once it's finished. So this is only available for a limited number of operators, but if it is one of the ones you're using, definitely make use of that. It's going to help with kind of you'll get cost savings out of that, help with performance in the rest of your Airflow instance. And the other 2.2 feature that you should make use of is timetables. So custom timetables will allow you to implement schedules that cron alone doesn't support. So this is if you've ever had to, implement like really complex branching within your DAG or have like multiple copies of your DAG to achieve getting it scheduled during, on a schedule interval that cron alone kind of doesn't support. Now you can just define your own custom timetable, and I would say best practice is definitely do that as opposed to the other workarounds. Again, going to make it like a lot more readable. You have a lot more control and just kind of much more sustainable there. And the final one I threw in here, this was kind of a minor feature release, either in 2.1 or 2.2, I can't remember. But just to give everybody aware that it's out there, you can set this hide sensitive variable connection fields variable to true in your Airflow config, and that's going to make sure that any sensitive variables get masked both in your Airflow logs and UI. So in terms of keeping Airflow more secure, that's a really easy, not so much DAG authoring actually, but just threw it in there because I think it's a useful feature, best practice that kind of everybody should make use of. Especially if you have, DAGs that are pulling in, sensitive variables or things like that, because you've templated them, because that's best practice. Make sure that you don't have passwords and stuff getting printed out in your logs. And then before I kind of go into one final example, I wanted to just throw out kind of a couple of other best practices. I've touched on some of these that, didn't fit into kind of one of the categories that we talked about before. But I think are still really important. One is to keep tasks atomic. So I did talk about this one. Again, make sure that kind of each task has, one thing that it's designed to do, so that if you do have to rerun things, you're not like rerunning one massive mega task that does everything. Use incremental record filtering. So this is if you are, again, processing data either within Airflow or another system, kind of design it to be idempotent so that you're not like processing all of your data every single time. Other sort of DAG design ones, use a static start date. This one also can seem sort of obvious, but you're going to run into trouble if your start date is dynamic. So it changes. That's going to confuse Airflow. Same thing, if you change your start date, change the name of your DAG as well. It's going to create a new entry in the metadata database. So just keep things from getting confused there. And I did cover this one, choose a consistent method when setting task dependencies. So again, kind of to highlight some of those, I have one kind of Airflow 2 good example. This doesn't go through all of the best practices in that I covered for Airflow 2 or on that last slide, but it does show a couple of them. I'm actually just going to show the graph view of this DAG first before I go into the code. It's a little easier to see. This is a great example of where task groups come in handy. So you can see these blue cells are task groups. If in general, this DAG is doing some branching based on what day of the week it is, and then kind of making a choice over which dummy tasks to execute based on that. So if I expand kind of my weekend here, you can see I've got a whole bunch of tasks in here in this task group. If I expand this one as well, there's a bunch in that one. You can see looking at this whole thing is a little bit overwhelming, and it's still only, I don't know, 15 or so tasks. So you can imagine if you have a DAG with like hundreds of tasks, these task groups can help a lot in terms of looking at the UI. So yeah, definitely use those. The other thing that this DAG does really well is use the task flow API. So one example of that is here. So I have this Python function for one of my fun weekend activities is going to the beach. Whoever wrote this DAG did not write it in Seattle in the winter. I wish I could go to the beach now, but anyways, instead of defining kind of a Python function that you then have to call explicitly in a Python operator, you can just use the task decorator. And Airflow is going to recognize that through the task flow API and go ahead and create that task for you. So that's all you have to do. Again, it's a little simpler and cleaner. I'm saying that this has multiple outputs, so those are going to be used kind of within another task. Same thing down here for the DAG decorator. So again, it's just kind of limiting the code that you have to write for that. You can see I'm defining my task groups kind of down here for each of these activities. And then this whole DAG is heavily templated. So somewhere I'm actually determining kind of what day of the week it is, again, based on that idempotent concept of pulling in the variables. So none of these are, I should say, hard coded, which would make this DAG pretty impossible to operate. For this example, that even is relatively pretty simple. Just making a choice based on 7 different options. Doing something like that with hard coding without templating is going to be really, really tough. So, and then kind of final thing I'll point out in this example is using this chain for dependencies. So I talked about kind of setting dependencies in a clean way. Earlier, you can obviously, always use like the standard bit shift operators, things like that. Chain is a function that you can use that's built in that is going to help when you have especially like lists of tasks that you're setting dependencies between. So it can be an especially clean way of setting them so that you can do this, in one line, even when your dependencies are kind of more complex. An example there, again, when I implement all of that, it looks very straightforward and clean here. Cool. And then, last thing I'll highlight here is we do have I should say first, all of this code, again, will be available afterwards. So you can look at these examples, especially the good ones. You will have those available to you. We also have a written guide that covers a lot of these best practices kind of written out in more detail with some examples. So that can be a great resource to go back in addition to the webinar recording. I'll also throw out there that for a lot of these Airflow 2 features, we have guides written on them on how to use them more explicitly. So if you're looking at them going, that's perfect for my use case, but I have no idea how to use this thing, definitely check out our guides because they're going to help you implement these and kind of get the most out of them for best practices. Cool. So I want to leave kind of the last 15-ish minutes open to do Q&A for any questions. It's like we've got quite a bit going on in the chat. Yeah,
chat's been popping off. Kenton, I fell into a coughing fit as soon as we started, so I went off camera and off mic. But that was incredible. A lot of good feedback in the presentation, Kenton. A couple of questions that I think have come up, and I can just feed them to you, and we can go from there.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Let's do it.
So, first question from Harish is: how would you organize multiple projects? Would you want to use separate DAG bags or create some factory pattern?
That's a good question. I would say, typical pattern would be, well, for like a specific Airflow instance to just have one DAG folder, although you could pull DAGs in from different projects. I guess it kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Like, do you have multiple kind of repos that are going into the same Airflow instance because of access control or something else? one way, I mean, there are definitely reasons to split things up into different airflow instances. So that's something we talk about at Astronomer a lot. Kind of the reasons you would do that. In general, from just like a best practices standpoint, I don't think there's anything wrong with pulling in DAGs from multiple repos. Again, it just kind of gets back to what is your reason for keeping them separate, and is that kind of conducive to having everything in the same environment. Not sure if that actually answers that question.
Yeah, I think it does. I think the other thing is, like, from what I've seen, is if you're putting multiple DAGs, multiple repos, once you start thinking about dependencies and requirements and so on, it's probably when you want to start thinking about having multiple airflow environments.
Yeah.
Cool. Next question is, the way you imported the files is you had a static path to include those external files.
Mhm.
Would it be better to do that as a dynamic path for dev and prod environments?
Yeah, you definitely can. I mean, you could template that for sure. The way that we have implemented our project structure that we typically use at Astronomer is to always have like this include directory that is specifically designed for, scripts, other scripts that your DAGs are going to call, like SQL scripts or Python scripts, things like that. So in this particular case, if you were using a structure like this, it should be the same for dev and prod, and maybe those scripts have templating that's different or something like that. But if you needed to, if you were pulling them in from somewhere else, you can definitely template that so that it is, yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Similar route is, do task groups only work inside of a with statement?
No, I don't think so.
I've only ever seen.
I think there's actually a task group decorator now.
Oh yeah.
So there are definitely other ways that you can define them. Yeah, and you can make them they can be created dynamically if they need to. They can be nested. There's like all sorts of things that you can do with them. Again, we have a really great guide that one of my colleagues wrote on doing kind of more fancy things with task groups that kind of covers a lot of that.
All right, I'm going to the next one here. All right. Is there a way that you can trigger task A in DAG A only on successful state of task B in DAG B? This is related to an autosys migration.
So based on the successful result of a task in a different DAG, am I understanding that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So before, I was going to say there is a concept called trigger rules, where you can set, kind of what has to happen upstream. So that could be anything from everything has to succeed to nothing has to succeed. So there's lots of different rules. That's all going to apply kind of within the same DAG. For different DAGs, if you need kind of cross DAG dependencies like that, there are a couple of ways you can do that, all of which would sort of be waiting for either the full DAG to complete or just like a specific task to complete successfully. Probably based on the wording of that question, I would say the external task sensor is going to be the best option, but there are others. So another topic that we have a great guide on that covers a couple of options. So check that out.
Yep, I just dropped that in the link here. All righty, going through the rest of this Q&A. Is there any difference between using the var.value versus variable.get when you're writing your DAG?
Yes. So I feel like I get this wrong every time I talk about it. I think they differ in like when that variable gets pulled in, and I would have to again go back and refer to the templating docs because I always forget which one. But yeah, there is. Sorry, I'm gonna like punt this question because I don't want to tell anybody the wrong thing, but I think they're like, depending on where you're pulling that variable in, one of them's better for kind of avoiding that top level code situation.
Yeah. Josh chimed in from astronomy. Use it outside of a task, it hits the metadata database versus inside of a task. It doesn't, it's part of the same call. I also dropped the guide to templating in the chat as well for Anonymous who asked that. Cool. Next question would be, alrighty. So we answered the autosys question. Sorry, here we answered this one. Alrighty. How much does a scheduler hate no non-DAG definitions in the DAG directory? Are there significant performance benefits to leaving out non-DAG files from the DAGs directory?
So within your DAGs directory, Airflow Scheduler is going to parse all Python files that contain the word DAG or the word Airflow on every one of those min file process interval variables, which again defaults to 30 seconds. So if you have files in the directory that do not contain the word DAG or Airflow, they will not be parsed every time. So shouldn't matter as much, although again, I think based on our kind of project structure, we think it's a little cleaner to lift them out. Otherwise, in general, yes, you do want to be careful about that. Kind of whether or not you will run into performance issues is highly dependent on both your Airflow infrastructure and the scale we're talking about. So like in my particular example here with like 5 DAGs, if I threw another couple files in here, I'm probably not going to see any issues. If you had thousands of files in there, you might see issues.
Let's see here. Oh, we already answered that one. What's the default value of hide sensitive var connection fields? I feel like that's one defined in the docs. I believe that's false, but I don't remember exactly. Maybe you do.
I'm pretty sure that it defaults to false, that you have to turn it on. The other thing is that you can define the list of what those, what the values that are considered sensitive are. So the default for that is pretty brief. I mean, it's like password, you know, and maybe like a couple of other things, but that's another thing to think about when you are turning that on is like, what do you want to mask? And you can, you know, put other words in that list if, you know, I don't know, the word like January is sensitive for whatever you're doing or something like
that. Yeah. It's a question around running Airflow on Kubernetes in production. That one's a little too long to answer here, but Boyang, please shoot us an email about that. That's pretty much what we do as a company. So I'll drop my email address in the chat there for you. I think that's all the questions that make sense to answer on the webinar right now. I'm just about out of time too. Thanks so much everyone for jumping on. Kent, thanks so much for the presentation. You really did an incredible job. We'll send everything out in a follow-up and we are looking forward to chatting with you all next time.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.